The string lights shimmered across the Savannah ballroom, scattering gold against crystal chandeliers. Laughter swirled with the clinking of glasses. Guests moved in pairs, leaning close, whispering, celebrating love. But at the very edge of the long table, she sat alone. Her name was Madeline Brooks. Her pale green dress had been chosen carefully, but tonight it only made her feel more out of place. She wasn't supposed to be here, not really. She was a +1 to her cousin's date, invited out of courtesy rather than closeness. Everyone else seemed to belong. Friends, spouses, colleagues. Madeline pressed her palm against the stem of her glass, pretending to study the bubbles rising in her champagne, hoping nobody noticed the emptiness of the chair beside her. It wasn't just loneliness. It was the sting of being invisible. At weddings, invisibility cut deeper because the whole night was built around the celebration of being chosen. Madeline had never been chosen. She leaned back, trying to steady her breathing, when a low voice brushed against her ear. "Pretend you're with me." Her heart lurched. She turned and saw a man, tall, sharp in a tailored navy suit. His gaze was steady and unreadable. His jawline was clean, his cufflinks gleamed like tiny stars, and his presence felt commanding, as though he didn't ask, but expected to be obeyed. Before Madeline could speak, his hand rested lightly on the back of her chair. To anyone watching, it would seem as if he was her date arriving late, claiming the seat that had been waiting for him all along. "What?" "Why," she whispered, her voice caught between confusion and disbelief. He leaned closer, his breath warm near her temple. "Because eyes are on me. And tonight, I can't be here alone." Madeline blinked. She searched for words, but her tongue felt useless. Guests at the nearby tables were already glancing their way. Some smiled knowingly, others raised brows with thinly veiled curiosity. He slid into the seat beside her, smooth and effortless, as if the space had been his all along. His hand brushed against hers, deliberate but gentle, sealing the illusion. Madeline's pulse hammered in her ears. "Play along," he murmured, almost like a command, yet softer than she expected. "It won't hurt you." Her instinct screamed to pull away, but a different instinct, older, heavier, told her to stay. She was tired of being the forgotten one. The overlooked guest at the corner. For once, she wanted to feel visible. So she nodded. Just barely. Her lips parting as if to breathe out consent. And with that, the stranger's expression shifted. Relief flickered in his eyes, though only for a moment before his mask returned, polished and unreadable. A toast rose across the ballroom. Glasses lifted. Madeline's hand trembled as she raised hers. And then she felt his hand covering hers beneath the table, steady, anchoring her. No one around them knew that just 5 minutes earlier, they had been complete strangers. But Madeline sensed it instantly. This wasn't a casual request. This was the beginning of something dangerous. Something that wouldn't let her return to the life she knew. Because the man beside her wasn't just any guest. He was Grayson Hale, the tech billionaire who had disappeared from the public eye 2 years ago. And with one whispered request, he had rewritten the script of her entire night, and perhaps her entire life. The ballroom music shifted into a slow waltz. Couples drifted onto the dance floor, their movements fluid, rehearsed, elegant. Madeline remained frozen in her chair, her hand still beneath his, her pulse refusing to calm. The stranger lifted his glass to his lips, the crystal catching the light, and spoke in a tone low enough only for her to hear. "You did well," he said, as if she'd passed some invisible test. Madeline's brows pulled together. "What exactly did I just do well at? Pretending to know you?" His eyes flickered toward the other tables. "Exactly. And you'll need to do it again." Before she could ask what he meant, a couple of older guests strolled by and greeted him with warm familiarity. He responded with the perfect smile of a man who had been performing his whole life. When they passed, Madeline leaned in, her voice sharp but quiet. "Who are you?" The corner of his mouth lifted, though his eyes remained guarded. Grayson. Grayson Hale. Madeline nearly choked on her champagne. The name was familiar. Hale Tech. The Hale Foundation. The Hale family appeared in business sections of every major newspaper. Tech, real estate, philanthropy. She remembered seeing his photo once in a magazine her boss had left in the break room. The caption beneath had called him the billionaire who vanished. Her stomach twisted. She had spent her whole life avoiding the spotlight. And here she was, hand in hand with one of the most recognizable faces in the country. "I can't do this," she whispered, pushing her chair back slightly. Grayson's hand shot out, steadying her wrist. "Wait. Don't walk away yet." His voice had hardened, but beneath it, she heard urgency. Desperation. "You don't understand. I need you." The words stunned her into silence. "You saw what just happened," Grayson continued. "Every person in this room watches me like a hawk. If I'm alone, they'll circle like vultures. Investors. Rivals. Even family. They'll take it as weakness." Madeline stared at him, her pulse unsteady. "So you want me to play your girlfriend for one night? Is that it?" Grayson leaned closer, his cuff brushing against her sleeve. "Not just for one night." His words dropped like weights onto her chest. "I need you for longer. I need a wife." Madeline's head snapped back. "Excuse me?" "I'm not speaking in riddles," Grayson said, his jaw tightening. "I need a wife on paper. A marriage that looks real. One that can stand up to questions. It's the only way to silence the rumors and lock down a deal that's worth billions." Madeline shook her head in disbelief. "This is insane. You barely know me." "Precisely why it works," Grayson countered. His voice lowered further, his eyes burning into hers. "You're ordinary. No one would suspect an arrangement. You're not chasing me like the others. And you're not tangled in the politics of my world. That's exactly what I need." Her laugh came out brittle. "You're asking me to marry you like it's some kind of business merger." "That's exactly what it is," Grayson said without hesitation. "A contract. Nothing more. You help me, and I make sure you never have to worry about money again. Your debts. Your rent. Your future. It'll all be handled." The words slammed into her. She thought of the overdue bills stacked on her kitchen counter. The endless shifts at the cafe. The nights she lay awake calculating how long she could stretch her savings. And here was this man offering to erase it all with a single signature. Yet her chest tightened with something other than relief. "You think you can just buy me," she whispered. Grayson's eyes softened for the first time. "No. I'm asking you to make a choice. A choice that benefits us both." He pulled a sleek leather folder from inside his jacket, as if he'd carried it in preparation for this very moment. He slid it onto the table, opening it just enough for her to glimpse the papers inside. Legal documents. Contracts. Signatures waiting for names. Madeline's breath caught. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a drunken whim whispered at a wedding. This was real. And for the first time that night, Madeline realized she had stepped into a story that was bigger, riskier, and more dangerous than anything she had ever known. Because Grayson Hale wasn't just offering her a seat at his table. He was offering her a place in his world. The Savannah night had cooled, but Madeline's thoughts burned hotter than ever. She sat in the back of Grayson Hale's car, the folder with her name waiting beside his still echoing in her mind. She hadn't said yes. Not yet. But she hadn't said no either. When they arrived, it wasn't a hotel or penthouse. It was the courthouse. No flowers. No music. Just legality. Grayson stood beside her, calm as ever. His suit was pressed, his tie immaculate, but his eyes held something different, not calculation, but a flicker of vulnerability. Inside, the clerk barely looked up. Grayson handed over the paperwork like he was filing a merger. Madeline's hand trembled as she signed. Her name looked foreign next to his. Grayson Hale. Madeline Brooks. Married. No kiss. No ring. Just ink. Outside, a photographer waited. Not paparazzi, someone Grayson had hired. They posed under the courthouse archway. His arm around her waist. Her smile practiced. His gaze steady. Closer, the photographer urged. Grayson leaned in. His hand found hers. And just before the shutter clicked, he looked at her, not as a businessman, not as a strategist, but as something almost real. The photo would silence rumors. It would sell the story. But Madeline knew the truth. She had just become a contract bride. By evening, she was inside his mansion, chandeliers dripping crystal, instructions for galas delivered by assistants. Madeline sat among silks and diamonds, clutching the plain locket she'd worn since her mother's passing. Later, Grayson passed her in the hall. Their eyes met. "You'll adjust," he said quietly. "And if I don't?" His gaze lingered. "Then pretend harder." She closed the door to her new room and leaned against it, her chest tight with both fear and something far more dangerous, curiosity. Because in the stillness, she could still hear the echo of his voice from that wedding night. "Pretend you're with me." And pretending already felt far too real. The mansion was never quiet for long. By the second week, Madeline's days were filled with fittings, rehearsals for dinners, and endless instructions on how to carry herself beside Grayson. His world moved with precision, as though every smile, every word, every touch was part of a script. She was expected to play the leading lady, though she felt more like an understudy who had been pushed on stage without lines to guide her. At their first public appearance together, a charity gala glittering with chandeliers and velvet gowns, Madeline's nerves nearly unraveled her. Cameras flashed, voices murmured, and Grayson's hand pressed gently against the small of her back. To the crowd, it looked like a gesture of affection. To Madeline, it was a reminder. Stay close. Stay steady. Play the part. You look pale, Grayson whispered through his practiced smile. Because I'm terrified, Madeline admitted under her breath. He glanced down at her, his eyes sharper than the polished glass around them. Then hold tighter to me. No one will notice the difference. She did as he said, slipping her hand into his. It should have been rehearsed, empty, mechanical. Yet his grip was firm, grounding, almost protective. Her heart betrayed her by responding, pounding as though it believed the lie they were telling. The night wore on with introductions, handshakes, and polite laughter. Madeline forced herself to smile, though she felt the stares. Some eyes measured her, calculating. Others dismissed her with a flicker of disdain. She could almost hear their whispers. Who is she? Where did he find her? She doesn't belong here. At the buffet table, a woman draped in diamonds leaned close enough for Madeline to catch the perfume. Interesting choice, Mr. Hale, the woman said, her tone dipped in sugar, but her eyes cutting. She's different. Grayson didn't flinch. He pulled Madeline closer, his arm sliding around her waist as he answered smoothly, she's exactly who I want by my side. The woman blinked, thrown off, and Madeline felt her face burn. Grayson's words were meant for show, she reminded herself. Yet, they curled inside her chest, warm and unsettling. Later, when the crowd began to dance, Madeline found herself cornered by a group of investors. Their questions were sharp, their smiles polite but edged. She stumbled over an answer about how she and Grayson met. The truth was too dangerous, so she reached for the story they had rehearsed, but her nerves tangled it. Suddenly, Grayson appeared at her side, his hand covering hers. She prefers not to talk about personal matters, he said firmly. And I'd appreciate if you respected that. The men backed off, apologizing. Grayson guided her away, his touch steady on her arm. "You almost slipped," he murmured when they were alone. "I'm not built for this," Madeline confessed, her voice trembling. "You're stronger than you think," he replied, his tone softer now. For the first time since their arrangement began, Madeline glimpsed something beyond the mask of the businessman. A flicker of sincerity, maybe even admiration. It rattled her more than the hostility of strangers ever could. As the weeks stretched on, their lives fell into a rhythm of performance. They dined together under chandeliers. They posed for photographs that appeared in society columns. They exchanged smiles that convinced the world. But in the small, unguarded moments, Madeline noticed the cracks. Grayson draping his jacket over her shoulders when the night air grew cold. Madeline reaching instinctively to bandage a cut on his hand after a meeting turned heated. Little things that hadn't been written into the contract. Each gesture blurred the line between their lie and the truth. And with every blurred line, Madeline's heart grew heavier. She reminded herself daily that this was temporary, a business arrangement, a mask. But late at night, when she stared at the photograph of their courthouse wedding on the mantel, the one where his eyes had looked devastatingly real, she wondered how long she could keep pretending without losing herself. Because the more they acted like husband and wife, the more Madeline feared that one day she would forget where the pretending ended and the truth began. The gala was designed to impress: velvet drapes, gold-trimmed invitations, and a guest list that read like a Fortune 500 directory. But for Madeline Brooks, it felt like a trap. She stood at the edge of the ballroom, her silver gown catching the light with every breath. The dress had been chosen for her, the jewelry borrowed, the smile rehearsed. But tonight, none of it felt like armor. It felt like bait. Grayson Hale was across the room, locked in conversation with investors. His posture was perfect, his voice calm, but Madeline could see the tension in his jaw. The rumors had reached a boiling point. Headlines speculated about their marriage. Tabloids called her a fraud. And tonight, the press had been invited. She tried to stay invisible, but the spotlight found her anyway. "Mrs. Hale," a voice called out, sharp and deliberate. Madeline turned. A journalist stood with a microphone, flanked by cameras. His smile was polite, but his eyes gleamed with intent. "Many are wondering about your sudden rise from obscurity," he said loudly, drawing attention. "Tell us, was this marriage about love, or was it simply a convenient contract?" The room hushed. Conversations paused. Faces turned. Madeline froze. Her throat locked. The truth clawed at her chest, but fear held it back. If she spoke, she'd be torn apart. If she stayed silent, the lie would consume her. Then Grayson appeared beside her. His hand closed over hers, firm and grounding. "You want the truth," he said, his voice resonant. He turned to the crowd, his gaze sweeping across the ballroom. "I married Madeline because she's the only person in this room who didn't want anything from me, except me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "She didn't chase my money. She didn't chase my name. She sat alone at a wedding, invisible to all of you. And in that moment, I saw the woman who had more dignity than anyone I'd ever met. That's why I married her." The journalist smirked. "That's a touching story, Mr. Hale. But where's the proof?" Grayson reached into his jacket and pulled out the contract, the one that had bound them. He held it high. "This was our agreement," he said. "At first, yes, it was business. A contract. But tonight, I end it." With deliberate force, he tore the papers in half. The sound cracked through the silence like thunder. Cameras flashed. Guests gasped. Madeline's heart pounded as she stared at the shredded pages drifting to the floor. Grayson turned to her, his voice low now, meant only for her. "I don't want a contract anymore. I want you." Her breath caught. She could feel the weight of 100 eyes, but all she saw was him, his steady gaze, the raw truth finally breaking through the mask. Before she could speak, applause broke out. Some clapped politely. Others with genuine awe. For the first time, Madeline wasn't the invisible girl in the corner. She was the woman standing beside the man who had just risked everything to make her real. The journalist tried to recover, firing off another question, but Grayson ignored him. He lifted Madeline's hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against her trembling fingers. The gesture was intimate. Undeniable. Impossible to stage. And in that moment, Madeline knew their world had shifted. The marriage was no longer a lie told to cameras and investors. It was something neither of them could pretend away. And the danger now wasn't in being discovered. The danger was that she believed him. Spring arrived quietly in the Georgia countryside. The air was soft, the trees dressed in new green, and the chapel tucked between the hills looked nothing like the places Madeline had stood before. It wasn't grand. It wasn't gilded. It was honest. Inside, she stood before a mirror in a simple white gown, no diamonds, no designer label, just fabric chosen for comfort and grace. Her hair was pinned loosely, her locket resting against her collarbone. The same locket she'd worn through every chapter of her life, the cafe shifts, the courthouse signature, the Gala Breakdown. It was the only thing that had never changed. Grayson waited at the altar. There were no investors. No journalists. No board members. Just a handful of friends, his sister, and Madeline's closest confidant from Charleston, the one person who had known her before the mansion, before the headlines, before the pretending. The chapel was quiet. No music played. The silence was sacred. As Madeline walked down the aisle, her eyes locked onto Grayson's. The same eyes that had unsettled her in a crowded ballroom now held no mask, no distance, only truth. She reached him, and for a moment, they simply stood there. No one rushed them. No one prompted them. The officiant waited, smiling gently. Grayson took her hands. His voice was steady, low, and meant only for her. From this day forward, he said, you are not my contract. You are my choice. You are not my shield. You are my heart. Madeline's throat tightened. Her voice trembled as she answered. And I'm not pretending anymore. I'm yours. For real. For always. They didn't kiss for the cameras. They kissed for themselves. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, painting them in soft colors, amber, rose, and blue. It felt like grace. Later, as they stepped outside into the golden afternoon, Grayson draped his coat around her shoulders. The same way he had done on one of their first nights together, back when everything had been an act. This time, it wasn't performance. It was love. The girl who had once sat alone at a wedding had become the woman who chose love, not because of wealth, not because of obligation, but because her heart had finally found its home. And as Grayson held her close, Madeline realized that the greatest vow they had ever made wasn't written on paper. It was written in the way they chose each other again and again, in a world that had once doubted them. Their story no longer belonged to contracts or whispers. It belonged to love. Were you holding your breath by the end? Hit like if you felt it. Drop a comment, we read every one. And subscribe with the bell on, so you're here for the next twist in the journey.